The basis of our research is the little-known protocol of the Technical Committee of the United States Navy, numbered 812/47, dated March 14, 1947th year. This document, once bearing the classification Top Secret, Copy Number 1, represents a dry report on the deformation of rivets and fatigue failure of metal on the hulls of ships in Task Force 68. It is precisely this report, and not the mystical legends of flying saucers, that allows us to reconstruct the authentic chronicle of events that unfolded in the icy wasteland. Before we proceed to a detailed analysis of this largest polar operation in history, I ask you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue working with archival primary sources, pay for access to closed collections, and prepare similar investigations based solely on documents, not speculation. The political anatomy of the late 1940s dictated its own conditions. The world had barely recovered from the global conflict, but already in 1946 year, it became evident that Antarctica was turning into a new theater of covert confrontation. From a geopolitical perspective, this continent was viewed not as a scientific platform, but as the Great Southern Flank, control over which ensured dominance in the southern latitudes of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. In Washington, they understood that the legal status of territories claimed by Great Britain, Argentina, Chile, France, and Norway remained undefined. The United States officially recognized none of these claims, but also did not formally advance their own, preferring a policy of de facto presence. Within the American elite, a fierce bureaucratic struggle unfolded. Admiral Chester Nimitz, holding the position of Commander-in-Chief of Naval Operations, saw the Antarctic expedition as an ideal opportunity to test the fleet's combat readiness in extreme conditions. However, the post-war period was characterized by a sharp reduction in the defense budget. The United States Congress demanded strict economy, and allocating funds for a polar voyage seemed to many legislators an unnecessary waste of resources. In this confrontation, Nimitz was aided by Admiral Richard Byrd, a cult figure for the American public, whose authority allowed him to lobby for the fleet's interests. The third key participant was Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen, appointed as the direct commander of the task force. They had to wage exhausting bureaucratic battles for every dollar, justifying the necessity of the expedition as preparation for a possible war in the Arctic against the Soviet Union. In the end, the project was approved under the code name Highjump, Operation Highjump. The mechanics of the operation impressed with their scale. Task Force 68 consisted of 13 ships divided into 3 groups: Central, Eastern, and Western. The core of the fleet was the aircraft carrier Philippine Sea, from whose deck heavy transport aircraft S-2D Skytrain were to take off using rocket boosters, a technology that had not previously been employed in such conditions. A detailed logistical estimate, prepared by the Navy's Supply Department, provided for the sustenance of 4,700 personnel. This required colossal resources. The total volume of provisions exceeded 5,000 tons. The ration norm was increased to 5,500 calories per person per day, which included canned ham, chocolate paste enriched with fats, freeze-dried vegetables, and hardtack biscuits. Special attention was devoted to fuel logistics. Fuel oil consumption for icebreaker-type vessels like the North Wind in the ice increased threefold compared to open water due to the constant operation of engines in variable modes. The submarine Sennett, which was part of the Central Group, encountered critical problems. Its hull was not designed for the pressure of ice flows, and the diesel engines required a special additive to prevent the fuel from turning into a jelly-like mass at -30 degrees Celsius. Steam lines laid along the main passages were used to heat the decks. But even this did not prevent icing of the mechanisms. Winches and cranes seized up due to the freezing of lubricants, which lost their properties and turned into a solid substance. The engineering personnel were forced to use blowtorches and makeshift electric heaters, which created a constant fire hazard on board. While the American ships advanced toward the Ross Sea, the Soviet Union did not remain a mere observer. In 1946, the whaling flotilla Slava was formed. Officially, its task was whale hunting to supply the country with fats. However, analysis of the group's composition and equipment points to broader objectives. The mother whaling ship was equipped with the latest Soviet radio interception and direction-finding systems of the time. Aboard the Slava, officers from the Navy's Hydrographic Service and radio intelligence specialists were present under the guise of scientific staff and technical personnel. Their mission involved monitoring the activity of the American fleet. Masking methods were worked out to the finest detail. Hydrographic depth and water temperature measurements, critical for submarine navigation, were presented as auxiliary data for locating whale pods. The Slava's patrol routes strangely coincided with the sectors of operation of the Eastern and Western groups in Operation Highjump. Intelligence data was transmitted to Moscow using rotor cipher machines similar in principle to the famous Enigma, but with their own algorithmic features. Messages were encoded in groups of numbers where each combination corresponded to a specific technical condition or geographic coordinate. The American communications worked similarly. Transmission of reports from the icy latitudes to Washington was carried out through relay stations in New Zealand and Panama. The use of ICM Mark II rotor machines ensured that intercepted signals would remain undeciphered during the critical decision-making time. However, magnetic storms and auroral phenomena in Antarctica often disrupted communications, forcing radio operators to repeat transmissions, which increased the risk of detection. One of the key tools of the Byrd expedition was mapping technologies. The use of trimetragon cameras of the K-17 type allowed filming vast areas. One camera looked straight down, while the other two were angled at 30 degrees to the horizon on both sides. These cameras were installed on Catalina flying boats and R-4D aircraft. However, a technical audit after the expedition showed that 40% of the filmed material was defective. The gelatin-based film became brittle in the frost and cracked during rewinding. Static electricity arising in the dry polar air created light artifacts on the film, which during development appeared as lightning discharges, obscuring terrain details. The lack of ground landmarks and errors in determining flight altitude made subsequent mosaicing of photo plans extremely difficult. Cartographers in the Naval Intelligence Office later stated that the accuracy of the obtained maps was plus or minus 5 kilometers, which was unacceptable for military purposes. December 30th of the year 1946 became a black date in the chronicle of the operation. The aircraft George 1, conducting a reconnaissance flight as part of the Eastern Group, crashed in conditions of whiteout, an optical phenomenon when the sky and ice merge into a single space without a horizon. The chronicle of the survival of the 9-person crew represents an example of human resilience and logistical chaos. Upon impact, 3 crew members were subjected to instantaneous cessation of existence. The surviving 6 people, including radioman James Robbins, found themselves in isolation at a temperature of -40 degrees. On the first day, they constructed a shelter from fuselage debris, using surviving parachutes as insulation. Food consisted of emergency rations, pemmican, a mixture of fat and dried meat, bars of bitter chocolate, and dry biscuits. The main problem was water. For its procurement, they had to expend scarce burner fuel to melt snow. On the third day, the survivors attempted to activate the emergency radio station, but its batteries discharged in the cold within a matter of hours. Only on the 6th day were they able to build a fire from the remnants of aviation kerosene and rubber, creating thick black smoke. However, due to poor weather, the search planes from the tender Pine Island could not comb the sector. Only after 13 days, on January 12, 1947, the crew of another patrol aircraft spotted glints from a signal mirror. The rescue operation was conducted in 2 stages. First, warm clothing and medications were dropped, and then, after visibility improved, a flying boat made a risky landing on the ice. The condition of the rescued was critical: frostbite of the extremities and extreme exhaustion. This incident became a powerful argument for the opponents of the expedition in Congress, who pointed to the unjustified risk to personnel. To understand the true scale of events, it is necessary to turn to the historical retrospective of German presence. In 1938, the Third Reich organized an expedition on the vessel Schwabia, under the leadership of Alfred Richer. The funding was carried out through the German Margarine Union, which was interested in finding new whaling areas to replace imported fats. During this mission, 2 Dornier Wal aircraft conducted a series of flights over Queen Maud Land, dropping metal pennants with the swastika emblem every 25 kilometers. However, analysis of the Schwabia's technical documentation and Richer's reports shows the complete impossibility of establishing any underground infrastructure. The vessel had a cargo capacity of only 8,000 tons, and the majority of this volume was occupied by aviation fuel and provisions for the crew. Building concrete bunkers or underground factories would have required dozens of such vessels and thousands of workers, which no intelligence of that time recorded, including the British, who closely monitored the German fleet. All theories about New Schwabia as a hidden fortress shatter against the dry logistics of tonnage and man-hours. Antarctica in those years was a global chessboard. The British Empire, as early as 1944, began the secret Operation Tabarin. The goal was to create permanent bases on the Antarctic Peninsula to prevent the use of these territories by German raiders and simultaneously secure sovereignty over disputed lands claimed by Argentina and Chile. The Argentine government, in turn, in 1947, sent its own fleet to the shores of Antarctica, which nearly led to an armed clash with British sailors. Thus, the American expedition was merely the largest element in a complex mosaic of territorial disputes. A critical audit of the results of Operation Highjump indicates that it failed to achieve many of its objectives. Admiral Byrd was forced to curtail the expedition a month earlier than scheduled. The official reason given was adverse ice conditions, but behind this lay logistical errors and technical failures. The fragility of American equipment in low-temperature conditions proved fatal for many systems. Breakdowns of icebreakers and the loss of several aircraft compelled the command to admit that the fleet was not prepared for full-scale operations in polar latitudes. Protocols of participant interrogations and internal reports point to serious friction between the military and scientists. The former demanded precise execution of maneuvers. The latter, time for conducting measurements. The documentary epilogue of this story is devoid of mysticism. After the fleet's return to the United States, a list of seized and damaged property was compiled, spanning more than 300 pages. The bulk of the operations archives remained classified until the end of the 1970s, which gave rise to numerous rumors. The fate of Soviet data from the Slava flotilla was also concealed in the depths of the hydrographic department of the USSR Navy. However, it was precisely these events that formed the basis of the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, which proclaimed the continent a zone free from weapons. The legal system of the era was compelled to adapt to the reality in which no single state could unilaterally control the icy continent due to insurmountable logistical difficulties. The archaeology of power in this case reveals not secret bases, but the limits of human and technical capabilities of that time. Every elimination of an aircraft or cessation of existence of a communication node was documented in write-off acts, confirming that the primary force in Antarctica was and remains nature, not political conspiracies.